narrative design. So narrative design is a fairly difficult topic because if you type that into Google, you will get 100 different things on like what you're doing, and so the narrative design that I'm focusing on right now is using gameplay to tell the story. And I watched this one video by Jerry Hornman. That was pretty interesting. It's only about 22 minutes long. I highly suggest giving it a look. So, what are the two main aspects of narrative design? I'm going to say that those are the mechanical aspects and the fictional aspects. So, the narrative aspects and the design aspects. Mechanical being the numbers that run the game, and fictional being like the story that goes alongside of it. And usually when you're making a game, usually when people are designing the game, they either start off with a mechanical structure and then build a story around it, and so that's what I'm calling mechanical to fictional. So like Demon Souls, Dark Souls, they start off with like a core mechanical gameplay loop, and then they start to build the story around it. Or Mario World, Super Mario World, it's all about the running and the jumping. It's not super important that you're going to save Princess Peach because you don't really know that nothing really tells you you're going to save Princess Peach until the end, and then you just have a bunch of eggs following you. Can you guys think of any other games that focus primarily on mechanical aspects and then build a story around it?
I would say probably Pokemon in some respects, because the stories generally aren't the main focus. It's just the fact that you're progressing, like with your team, and collecting those Pokemon.
Any other Pokemon? Yeah, Pokemon. And I will probably talk about this later, but mechanical to fictional and fictional to mechanical, which is the alternate version of this, each have like a main problem. And for fictional to mechanical, fictional to mechanical, it's usually unoriginal gameplay. So a lot of story-based games, they take the gameplay from something else and throw it into their story-based game, because since everyone is focusing on making the story, they'll just grab some mechanics that work elsewhere and they'll just throw it into their game. And they're not necessarily thinking about how they can make mechanics in order to enrich the gameplay experience. But mechanical to fictional has a similar problem with like Pokemon, where they've got these mechanics and they're basically just copy-pasting the story that they had in the last one with like one or two changes. And then fictional mechanical, and this is where you start with a world and find out which mechanics fit into that story, i.e. The Last of Us, and probably a bunch of other games, but I can't think of any off the top of the head. Can you guys think of any games that focus primarily on story and mechanical aspects of the game are backburners? Yes?
What Remains of Edith Finch is a lot like this.
Yeah, so that's kind of a walking simulator game. Mm-hmm. Games that get titled walking simulator are primarily to the point where the only mechanic is you walk forward in most cases. Edith Finch, they have different like gameplay things that you go into depending on like what memory you are.
There's like little mini games,
yeah.
But it's mainly just walking around.
Yeah. And those mini games are probably what I would call a mixed type of gameplay, where you have the story you want to tell and you kind of are building the mechanics and the story are going into and out of each other. So say in Eco, it is a story about saving a princess, and so you actually have to grab onto the princess's hand and drag her everywhere you go. And since it's about saving the princess and you're the hero, which is the little guy. Has anyone played Eco? No, it's an older game. It's a lot of fun. Since you're the hero, you technically can't be hurt by any of the enemies. All they can do is slow you down, and try to capture the princess. So basically, you get slowed down slightly, and so it makes it more difficult to. If one of them grabs the princess and is trying to take it away, all the enemies are doing is preventing you from getting to the princess in order to rescue her. And that gameplay loop of saving the princess goes into the story of saving the princess. And so they kind of mix together in an interesting way. But the mixed one is kind of hard to tell because you could technically say Eco is a narrative-based game where they took some mechanics and made some mechanics to fit into the narrative. Whereas I am usually with my narrative to mechanic, which I was talking about earlier, that is, the distinction would probably be if you start with the narrative and that is such the focus to the point that you don't worry too much about what mechanics are saying. So The Last of Us, even though it has very good shooter gameplay, the shooter gameplay, for the most part, except for in like certain positions or like story beats, for the most part, it doesn't add much to the story of parenthood, even to the point where Ellie is basically immune to all enemies. So there's like certain points where you can rescue her and she's in danger, so you have to go save her. But for the most of the gameplay, you don't have to teach her anything. You don't have to give her guidance. The story of parenthood does not mix with the gameplay. Any questions?
What are your thoughts on D&D with regards to narrative design? Obviously, that's
Purple.
largely DM dependent, but
Yeah, so
in the traditional sense.
in the traditional sense, so there's two aspects of D&D. There is dungeon crawling, and there is here's a quest, go complete the quest. Dungeon crawling tends to be mechanical to story. So here's a big old dungeon. There's a bunch of enemies in it. I guess I have to figure out some reason why you guys are going into a dungeon. Whereas big old quest is here's the story of you going to slay this king. I guess I have to figure out some enemies that you'll have to fight along the way in order to get you into a state where you can fight the king. But D&D tends to be more mechanically biased in general due to how like the what is it called? The player book, the player's handbook is set up. So if you read the player handbook, 95% of what you're reading is just like mechanical stuff. And like how this affects you mechanically. And if you read like the DM's guide, or Volo's Guide to Monsters and those type of things, it's mostly here's the creature, what are the stats? And a lot of times they don't even tell you why this creature would attack your party.
I think Monsters Manual is that way. DM's Guide and Xanathar's Guide. Well, not Xanathar's.
Volo's Guide to Monsters.
I think DM's Guide is more narrative, actually.
Okay.
I think that for D&D in specific, it kind of course it's DM dependent, like you said, but it kind of depends on whether it's like a long form campaign or a short form campaign. Because from what I've watched and what I've like kind of been picking up as while trying to become a DM, is that when it comes to working with like long form things, you'll have like an idea of like this is kind of what I want to do, and then you try to fit in like encounters into it, like you were saying. But if you're doing a lot more short form stuff, you're like, well, I want them to encounter this at some point. How do I make them go to this area?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, yeah, it has both, but it kind of depends on whether you're doing a really long-term thing or short-term thing.
It is heavily dependent on the DM. So when I go about making a D&D campaign, it depends on like the week for me. Sometimes I'm like, okay, here's some people I want you to interact with and have a conversation with. And that is probably more narrative based. And if you want to, you can fight these people because they have stats and health and everything. I've prepared that. But you don't have to. You can just have a conversation with them and then leave them on their way. Whereas other weeks, I'm like, here's a monster that I want you to defeat. I guess I'll just give you a guy, because I think it would be interesting for us to go and play this fight. So I'll just give you a guy who says, hey, go fight that monster. And so it's dependent on the week and dependent on like how the players interact with it, because D&D is a weird thing because it is a set of rules on how to make a game as a group. So the player's guide is like, hey, here are some rules on what you as players can do. The DM's guide is, hey, here are some rules on like what you as a DM should probably do, but all of the rules can be broken in various ways and things can be shifted around. And so it leads to an interesting situation where it's heavily dependent on like the DM and the players. But it might even go into mixed because it's going back and forth constantly between mechanical mainstay and narrative mainstay.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? No. What is the goal of these two different things? The primary goal is to give the player a meaningful experience. That's the reason I think we make games. What does meaningful mean? I don't know. Depends on... I think it's a vague enough word that it actually works for all games, but meaningful could just be an enjoyable experience, it could be a learning experience, it could be a bunch of different things, but that's kind of what we want from games. We want the player to finish the game or play the game and stop playing the game and go, I enjoyed that, that was worth my time, that was worth my money. And mechanics to fiction, where you primarily focus on mechanics and build the fiction around that, that is focused on the moment-to-moment gameplay. So League of Legends is, even though it has all this lore and has all this story, and what's the game you really like?
Overwatch?
Yes, Overwatch. Even though it has all this lore and has all the story of like why this character's got a background and all this stuff, and it has a lot of interesting stuff there, and they're even going to make comic books.
You said that.
That's not what makes you come back to the game. What makes you come back to the game is that core gameplay loop of choosing your hero, starting the game, and going in and shooting or punching or I don't know what people do in Overwatch, flying or teleporting back in time or whatever. That's why you do it, for that enjoyable experience. Whereas fiction to mechanics focuses on the overall feeling of the game. Horror games specifically tend to fall in this one, where Dead Space. Anyone here play Dead Space? Dead Space was extremely focused on giving every single piece of information that you're getting to be diegetic, that is, in the game. So every single, if you can see how much ammo, I can't remember the name of the protagonist, has, he could also see that. So your health bar is on his back with a little energy meter. You have another energy meter telling you how much power you have, and so like all of the stuff that you're being informed of that you need to know as a gameplay or as a player is coming from within the world. And by doing that, the game is able to immerse you more easily into the world, and immersion is an extremely necessary aspect of fear, because if you're constantly going, this isn't real, I don't really care what happens, then you're not going to be afraid. And in my personal opinion, Dead Space does that really well. At least the first one. I haven't played the second one. Any questions on the goal?
I think that horror games would tend to be fiction to mechanics. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah,
Or-
fiction
okay.
to mechanics is what I was saying. If I was unclear. So
I thought you
horror
were saying
games,
mechanics to fiction. I was like,
no. Horror
totally
games
agree.
tend to be fiction to mechanics. Games probably like Dark Souls, games where the core and looter shooters, games where the core gameplay loop is why you're going into the game, is those tend to be mechanical to fiction. The core gameplay loop in Dead Space, though moderately enjoyable and fairly visceral, of deciding the angle of your weapon and chopping off the limbs of creatures, is not why I went back to it a second time. It's because I wanted to make it through that next room and see what's there, which is due to the interesting story. And the reason I stopped playing Dead Space is because I was so scared of what was in the room that I was currently in that I couldn't keep on going. And so it has its negatives and pluses, but I do think it is an enjoyable game. What is the cost? Can you guys think of any negative effects of focusing primarily on fiction or mechanics? How that could affect your
If you
game?
focus too much on mechanics, you could probably overload like a game with too many things,
Half makes sense.
rather than like it's like you'll come up with something and be like, hey, that should be in the game, and then come up with something else and be like, that should also be in the game, and not actually think about how that might fit in with like the actual feeling of your game, because it seems like the fiction side of things is kind of how things kind of get tied together.
Yeah.
While on the flip side, with fiction to mechanics, you might have like some underwhelming aspects to it. I haven't played. Wait, what was I gonna?
The Last of Us? Or?
No, it was a different game that people were raving about a lot. It was kind of anime.
Was it?
No. No. It was. They said the gameplay wasn't the most interesting, but the.
So many games.
Didn't get wrong, but
Why am I thinking Deus Ex Machina? Not that.
Nier Automata.
Nier Automata. Yeah, like, where it was like I was just talking about this like yesterday, but they were saying about how like the mechanics, it was like actually pretty uninteresting, but the story was like so interesting that they kept on playing.
That's odd, because I would argue that the mechanics are not necessarily interesting, but on a visceral level, very enjoyable. Which is kind of what mechanics is focusing on. Is it fun to press the button? Is that fun? Yeah.
Okay.
I think with the mechanics to fiction, you run into a problem that a lot of the Xenoblade games have, where a lot of the battles and stuff just feel very repetitive after a while. And like with some of the games, like the first one and the second one, the story does kind of help motivate that a bit more.
Yeah.
There's like cutscenes that actually feel like they're doing their job, albeit a little bit too much.
Yeah.
There's like 10 minutes of cutscenes gets boring after a while.
Yep.
But the middle child that no one talks about, Xenoblade X, that one pretty much had like no story because they were focusing so much on like the battle mechanics of like using the scales and all these different combat arts that they kind of just didn't focus on what's tying everything together in this world. So it just feels like I'm fighting a bunch of monsters for nothing.
Yeah.
And like that just becomes really uninteresting after a while.
Yeah. So games that I think excel by focusing on mechanics are like rhythm-based games. So Guitar Hero and those type of games. There's one that I'm thinking of, but I can't remember the name of it, where you're like a beetle going down a line and you have to.
Oh yeah.
Rhythm Heaven?
No, the dark one.
Oh, Parappa the Rapper?
No, but yeah, Parappa the Rapper. These type of games, even if there wasn't a story, it's so enjoyable to press the button at the right time and to get the little ding type sound when you're getting correct, that even if there's no underlying story, you would play it anyway. Whereas fiction to mechanic games tend to be games like, I don't know, it's hard to think. Sorry.
VNs.
Huh? What?
Virtual novels.
Yeah, virtual novels, where once you've played a virtual novel, for the most part, you know how to play a virtual novel. It's never, usually, clicking yes or no to someone asking you to date is never more interesting unless you care about the player, unless the story is good. But usually the clicking is not that different. But there are some games that focus on fiction. I'm focusing specifically on Spec Ops: The Line. Anyone know what that is? Spec Ops: The Line is an older game that came out during a time period when there was basically nothing but a ton of third-person cover-based shooters. And they all, if you were to look at all of their box covers lined up, it would be hard to tell them apart because they were all so similar. And Spec Ops: The Line took that third-person cover-based shooter game and just basically just ripped it out of wherever it was, did not change any of the mechanics that everyone was using, and then built around that a very interesting story of a soldier dealing with the fact that he might be he is a terrible, terrible person, and having to deal with like a bunch of psychological stuff. And so when you do fiction to mechanical, one of the biggest problems you run into is the gameplay can tend to be derivative, but you can take derivative gameplay and build an interesting story around it that focuses on the fact that it's derivative gameplay and uses it to challenge a lot of the games that use this gameplay, because without thinking about it. And so even though the gameplay, you get the benefit of having this tried and true gameplay that is a lot of people are using and is fairly interesting, but you also get a very well thought out story that challenges why we use this gameplay in the first place. And so mechanic to fiction tend to not have very good stories, and for a lot of players who just want to get into a story, then there's nothing for them there. And if the gameplay ever gets repetitive or stops being interesting and new, there's nothing keeping them in the game. Fiction to mechanics, games tend to draw heavily from other games' mechanics, and they can get derivative. And the mixed version, which tries to get both the story of the game and the mechanics of the game to work together and both be good, these take a lot longer to make and are a lot more expensive, and it's oftentimes you have to come up with completely original or new mechanics in order to get them to fit the story you want to tell. As previously noted, Eco, during the time that was made, everyone had a health bar. Eco has no health bar because that doesn't fit in with the story they're making, so they came up, hey, here's a new way of dealing damage and whatnot. How do we do it? Depends. Mechanical to fiction. If you have a game that is heavily focused on mechanical and you want to write the story for it, my suggestion would be to find the core feeling that the gameplay evokes on its own. So if the gameplay is extremely challenging, then the core feeling might be overcoming difficulty, and then build a story where your character is overcoming large amounts of difficulty. Yes, or Dark Souls.
I figured you were going for Dark Souls.
Yeah, that's just my commonplace example. But can you guys think of any mechanical examples? So let's say this is a game that's all about quick twitch reaction and seeing a guy and immediately pressing the button to, let's say, kill the guy. Can you think of like a story that can work well with quick twitch? There's something, I gotta press the button as soon as possible, and if I'm not constantly pressing the button when I need to do it, then I lose.
I feel like there's a specific game that you're referring to.
There is, but I don't know the name of it, so just coming up with like a slight story would be feasible. Just like anything.
I know it's more of a mixed game. Celeste kind of does this, where like it is a lot of like very intricate platforming segments, and the whole story of Celeste is like overcoming like inward challenges and whatnot. So
Yeah.
kind of mirrors
I was shifting away from like difficulty to simple quick twitch reaction time type thing. So the main mechanic is you see a thing and you have to press B as soon as possible, and then another guy comes in, and if you don't move out of the way, you're gonna get hit by something.
I don't know why, but I thought of Duck Hunt.
Huh?
I've never played Duck Hunt before, but like, based on the descriptions of like what I've heard about it, I thought of Duck Hunt. So.
Cool.
I
So
mean, that makes sense. It's like a
hunting.
hunting
It's just
game.
a hunting game.
Which is, hunting is that same way,
Yeah.
more or less.
There is Mad Dog McCree.
What's that about?
It's this old arcade game where it was like filmed, like actual like live action cutscenes, and it would just be still for a while, and then some guy somewhere on screen like
Pops out.
Pops up, and if you don't press or aim at him like immediately, you die.
Yeah.
So that had a lot of that.
Or like, is that similar to kind of like when you go to an arcade and there's one of those like story shooters?
Yeah.
With like the controller or whatever?
Yeah.
So I don't remember the name of the game, but there's this game where it's a 2D top-down game where you're a guy with a shotgun going through, I think, clubs in like some place.
Hotline Miami?
Yeah, Miami. Hotline Miami. That game is very quick twitch action, and the gameplay of it being in Miami and the club scene kind of brings up the idea of cocaine, and slightly, depending on like where your mind is, brings up the idea of cocaine and the quick reaction times and all that stuff, and the repetition of it brings up this very visceral, focused train of thought. And then fictional to mechanical. How can we go about making these games? A lot of games just grab mechanics from other games and slot them into where they kind of fit. But we can usually be slightly more interesting than that. Let's say I have a story where you are the hero, and it's your goal to get from the place where you are to a castle far away, and you'll probably have to run into enemies along the way. Can you guys think of any mechanics that would work well with you being the hero of the story trying to save the kingdom?
The first thing that came up to mind are the basically like random encounters. If you were to go down that kind of route where it's like, if you have to get to the kingdom and there are enemies on the way, you'd have like random encounters with those enemies depending on like what your type of gameplay is, if it was like turn-based or something. If not that, it would probably be something like increasing the pace of the game, like, or the usual gameplay that you're doing, because you know that you have to be there faster. Those are the two things that came to mind at least.
Any other, so currently random encounters on your way to the castle, and increased pace of combat depending on how much.
Because you want to make it feel like you're
running out of time.
Faster.
That's fairly interesting. So as your time goes down in the time it takes to get to the castle, you have to complete the combat. So like it's turn-based, but somewhat similar to Final Fantasy 15, Final Fantasy 7, where your turns are like loading slowly. Anyone play Final Fantasy 7?
It has like the limit bar. Or
Yeah.
Is it the limit bar that is that?
No,
or?
your turn is like, even though you
It's a
have
turn
turns, technically your turn can get filled out and then you not do your attack and it just sits there waiting for you to do
Same
it.
with Chrono Trigger.
Yeah, so you can, so that would go faster as the game progressed, giving you, first of all, it's a challenge curve that we're getting into the game of, we're teaching you the mechanics while you're with a slower speed, and then we are hiking up the difficulty not by giving you more mechanics to dig through, but by giving you the same mechanics but less time to choose which attack or defense thing you want to do. So that's an inbuilt challenge curve that we're getting into the game. And also the increased speed kind of works into the increased pressure of needing to get to the castle as time goes by.
Like, but what I just like thought of that is somewhat similar is like if you've ever played Kirby Superstar Ultra, when there's like you have to get off the ship, kind of, where they increase the pace of your, or like they add like a timer, like your time is counting down, and normally you'd kind of like be moving around the level, being like, okay, what power up should I get? Generally moving to the right. But then inside of that specific like area, you're like, okay, I have to beat this thing fast. I have to get through this fast. And then they're like, okay, you got this power up, buddy. Get through this part faster. And it kind of feels like that'd be what that would be building up to, where it's like you have like the basics, you know what everything kind of does, you know what these power ups do, but then now it's like now you have to do this all faster.
Yeah.
Breath of the Wild kind of this as well, where like the whole central climax of Breath of the Wild is that you have to go to the heart of Ganon's castle. And they just make that progressively more and more difficult by increasing the amount of guardians that spawn around it. The strength of the guardians now, instead of being decayed, they're actually stalkers. And just making the castle itself sort of a labyrinth that has a bunch of the guardians patrolling it in and out. So like that kind of just like gives you increased difficulty, but also stuff becomes important in the game now, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. And it adds to the feeling of invading the castle. There's a couple possible stories that you can get through invading Ganon's castle. One of them is a stealth route, and all of this is just here's a castle, invade it, figure out how you want to do it. And one of them is a stealth route where you sneak into Ganon's castle, no one knows you're there, and you kill Ganon before anyone's the wiser. Any of his cronies are the wiser. Another one is the straight up, I'm walking to the front gate, killing every single enemy in my way, walking up to Ganon after slaying his entire army, and then beating him there. Which is a different story that you can get from that, due to interacting with very similar mechanics in a different way. And then another one is, there's a waterfall, I'm going to swim up that, and then I'm going to light something on fire, and then do my glide jump a couple times in order to get to the top of the thing in a matter of seconds, and just skip everything, which is the path I took. I was ready to be done at that point. But you get a bunch of interesting stories from basically having this one swath of mechanics and which ones you choose to interact with. And everyone who's invaded Ganon's castle has had a slightly different story of how that went for them.
I think that part of choosing mechanics that fit the story, I think that with your example, or with the framework that you gave us, we need to know more of why the player is going to the castle.
Yeah, so
we need to know more about the kingdom. We need to know more about, why are we going to this castle? Is it because the castle's been taken over? Is it Bowser's castle? Is it
I don't know, I didn't think as far ahead.
Corrupt kingdom? And if it's a corrupt kingdom, then is there a way that we can introduce that in various little encounters along the way?
Let's say that the person in charge of the kingdom is slowly denigrating the technology of the kingdom, and you have to go and stop him from denigrating that technology, or all the technology will be lost, and all the people who rely on that technology to survive will lose all of that technology and die. And from that, we can kind of build up a mechanic of, say you have a technologically based weapon, that weapon now can, as time goes by, might not always work. And so you can add in like those type of mechanics. And
or like the resource it requires becomes more scarce.
Yeah. And then you can have the enemies you fight early on be more so mechanical based monsters with like range attacks and other things, whereas later on you're fighting actual beast type creatures which are a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more focused on dealing damage to you and those type of things. Any questions about narrative design, or at least the narrative design that I talked about today?
I think it ties really closely with, I think it was 2 weeks ago's workshop on encounter design.
Yep.
Shameless plug.
Yep. That was a pretty good one. Good thing you're plugging it 2 weeks after it happened.
No, like go back and watch it on YouTube.
Yeah.
With the good sound quality.
It was amazing sound quality.
Anything you would have liked me to talk about in narrative design, especially you, writer?
I writer, yes. VR games are interesting.
Yeah.
Because they feel very atmospheric, which would be fictional. Then again, they're also heavily reliant on their mechanics
Near games?
in VR games.
Oh, VR games. VR games are funny because they're kind of like this new thing that a lot of designers don't really know what to do with, and there's like a good like 75% of them which are basically just experiences. So it's basically just, hey, you're in Batman's cave. What can I do there? Not much. You can kind of move stuff around and look at it. You can't really do much there. I would say, even though VR games focus a lot on making things feel real art-wise, they tend not to have much fiction as to like why this looks this way. It just kind of is, and it looks cool. But if you're playing a VR game, and I was playing one earlier, and you're in the skyscraper with an incredible view of like a city below you, it won't give you any information on like why the city's there, what's going on with the city. It won't give you any like actual story elements or background or world building. It'll just give you the pretty city. And though you can do a lot of narrative stuff with art and whatnot, if it's just the cool art, it's not really story. And I find a lot of the mechanics of a bunch of VR games fairly disappointing. Some of them are fairly interesting, but a lot of them, you play them for 30 minutes, and then there's no reason to play it for another 30 minutes because it's just not changing much. But I'm not the biggest fan of VR. They've been trying to do it since like the 90s, and
Virtual Boy.
huh?
Virtual Boy.
Yeah, and most of it is mediocre at best.
It's because it can never become mainstream,
It costs too much currently.
and no one has enough space. You can't.
It runs into a bunch of different problems.
It will always be niche, and because of that, it can never be refined.
Yeah, and
The design behind it will never be. There will never be VR design because it's too niche.
and I think walking simulators are a good place to deal with VR. VR is a good place to have. Is a good place to build a walking simulator, and walking simulators work really well in VR because a lot of what walking simulators do is give you this environment, and you follow a fairly planned out path and slowly uncover stuff. And like a couple detective things where you can pick up someone got killed by a mace in this room, you can pick up the mace and look on it and see if there's any blood on it. And if there's no blood on it, maybe this isn't what killed the guy, or stuff like that. But actual visceral gameplay, VR is not really set up for that right now because of how finicky the controls can be. And if you want your gameplay to be very reactive and very responsive, then when the player has to very easily know, when I press this button, this will happen no matter what. Whereas with VR, when I press this button, if my hand is slightly tilted to the right, instead of shooting where I wanted it to go, I'm accidentally shooting like 3 feet or to the right, and it's harder to aim, it's harder to figure out where stuff is, it's harder to do exactly what you want to do.
Part of that is probably because, like, when it comes to niche things, having a lot of people working on stuff is like makes more room for like design, like you see all the indie games. But the issue is that even the barrier of entry to actually like making something that might be interesting is so high that like those people that would make like really interesting things that the VR might be used for aren't gonna be made because it costs too much to even start trying to work in VR.
Also, production-wise or economics-wise, the VR, it's hard. So VR is a niche community that not a lot of gamers have, And so if you're trying to make a niche game in a niche community, that's a very small market you're dealing with. Whereas if you were to make a niche game in, let's say, Undertale, despite its ubiquity currently, Undertale is a fairly niche game. But because it was a niche game, it was able to get its audience and get its audience very passionate about it, and thus was able to spread to a large number of people. Whereas if Undertale or an Undertale type game, a game of Undertale's quality, were to be on VR, even though it would be harder for the people who really want to play that type of game to get access to that type of game, and it'd be harder for them to even know it exists because it's in this medium that most people don't have access to.
I would make the argument that Undertale seems more fiction to mechanics.
Yeah.
So then if you were to make something that's fiction to mechanics inside of a VR game, it would probably be, and it was also like at the same quality as Undertale,
Yeah.
that would probably still get some ubiquity, just by the fact that the narrative is good enough that people would want to play it if it became like popular enough with like YouTubers.
Yeah, that's why I would argue that virtual reality works better with fiction to mechanic games. Simply,
Beat Saber.
I'm not saying that nothing in there where it's mechanic. I think fiction to mechanic games can exist more easily in VR because since the mechanics of what we can do is not well thought out and not well planned out, just making a story and using a couple of the mechanics that we do have is a little bit easier than trying to come up with new mechanics for VR.
I would argue that you can either rely heavily on one or on the other, but mixed would
It's
be
hard
the
to
hardest
do
one to
both.
do in VR. I think that you can.
It's hard to do
one or the other.
long form gameplay in VR currently.
Yeah.
Fairly easy to go, okay, you swing the sword and stuff falls to pieces. That was a fairly interesting game I played. Then it put in like climbing and platforming elements, and I was like, nope, screw this game. I can barely do that in first person games. Can't do it in real life where I gotta move my arms around in order to jump. That didn't work.
I'm a bit surprised that like level design wasn't brought up at all. Like how, like one of the thing that I thought of when it was like narrative design was like the
How to tell a story through a level.
yeah
I was mostly going for a broader
yeah.
collection of thoughts. There's definitely a more focused version of
That's
this.
like a subset that has like this whole
Yeah, there's, and I think we did stuff on like level design previously.
Yeah.
And encounter design, and so I just wanted to go for a broader
It's a bit
thing.
more like elastic.
Yeah. So I'm gonna end this here.